Hey everybody, and welcome to this revision tutorial for GCSE History. Today we're going to revise a topic on paper 3. We're going to look at the early years of the Weimar Republic, and that means we're going to look at some of its early problems. We're going to focus a little bit on the Versailles Treaty, and we're going to touch on the crises of 1923. So first up, let's look at the big picture. The Weimar Republic was around from 1919 to 1933, and it really helps if we break that period down. So first of all, between 1919 and 1923, we get the early years of the Weimar Republic, and this is a time when the Weimar Republic was really quite fragile. It was struggling to cope with the problems left over from World War I, and it was at risk of being overthrown by extremist groups. This is also the time when the Nazi Party is just getting started. Then in 1923, we have a year of crisis for the Weimar Republic. 3 major crises rock the Republic, and we'll look at those later in this little tutorial. Between 1923 and 1929, the Weimar Republic seems to recover, so we call this the Weimar Republic's golden years. This is the period when Stresemann was doing a lot of work to try and fix the economy and also to improve Germany's reputation abroad. In that period, the Nazi parties are going through some really unsuccessful years. So these are what we call the Nazis' lean years. Then in 1929 we get another crisis. This of course is the Great Depression, which spreads to Germany, and it's after that, between 1929 to 1933, when the Weimar Republic is finally going to fail. And of course those years are the Nazis' most successful years. So here's our big question: why was the Weimar Republic so fragile in the years 1919 to 1924? Well, there's a mnemonic you can use to help you remember this. Here it is. First of all, the Weimar Republic was suffering because of the results of the Versailles Treaty. It was at risk of being overthrown by extremist groups and suffering from the stab in the back myth. Last but not least, let's not forget, the Constitution also created problems for the Weimar Republic. Now, we're going to look at each of these, but we're not going to look at them in that order. However, it's really useful to know the mnemonic. It helps you to remember. Okay, so first up, let's look at the Versailles Treaty. This was hated in Germany and made the Weimar Republic very unpopular. Firstly, because it was seen as a diktat in Germany. Germany had no say in what was written in the treaty. The big 3 countries, Britain, France and America, wrote the treaty for Germany, and then they invited Germany to sign the treaty in the Palace of Versailles in Paris, France. Germany was told, sign the treaty or else we'll start fighting you again. And so they had no choice but to sign. The second reason why the treaty was so unpopular in Germany is because of the terms of the treaty, which were simply so harsh. And there's a mnemonic you can use to remember this too. The mnemonic is LAM. Now, we're not going to do it in that order, but let's recap some of the terms of that treaty. First of all, blame. This was Article 231 of the treaty, also known as the War Guilt Clause. And it said that Germany was to blame for starting the war. This angered Germans because many of them did not see their country as the one which started the war. Now, because Germany had to accept the blame for the war, this also meant Germany had to accept punishment for the war. And the first punishment was money. Germany was forced to pay heavy reparations, a total of 6,600 million, mostly to France, to repair the war damage. And at a time when the Weimar Republic is just getting started and really suffering from the economic damage which the war had caused in Germany, this reparations bill was really difficult for the Weimar Republic to pay. Next up, the armed forces were restricted. Up until this point, Germans had long been proud of their strong military forces, but the treaty changed all that. The German army was limited to 100,000 soldiers. the navy was limited to 15,000 sailors with only 6 battleships. No submarines, no air force. And part of Germany, the western part, around the River Rhine, the Rhineland, was demilitarized. That means Germany was not allowed to place its soldiers in that part of the country, and this was done to reassure France and to protect France from any future invasion. Last but not least, let's talk about the land. Germany lost 1/6 of its land, including some valuable farmland in West Prussia, which became part of a new Poland. Germany also lost Alsace-Lorraine, which had to be given back to France. As part of losing this land, Germany lost 10% of its best industry, and it also lost 6 million people who were now no longer living in Germany, but living in other countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland. Okay, now closely following on from the Versailles Treaty, we have the stab in the back myth. Remember, at the end of World War I, the Kaiser abdicated, and politicians took over, including the Social Democrats, led by this man, Friedrich Ebert. Now, when they took over, Germany was suffering. There was starvation, there was unrest on the streets, and it was clear to them that Germany was going to lose this war. So they had little choice but to sign a ceasefire, an armistice. And then in 1919, they went on to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Now, at this point, the German army had not actually yet been beaten on the battlefield, and there were no foreign troops inside Germany. However, because of the problems inside Germany, the starvation and the uprisings, these Social Democrats really did have no choice but to sign the armistice. And that led to the development of a myth or a rumour that somehow the brave German army had been betrayed by these Weimar politicians who had stabbed the army in the back by signing a ceasefire. And so these German politicians get called the November criminals, who betrayed the German army by signing the armistice in this way. And in fact, this is something which army leaders in Germany encouraged, because it meant that they didn't have to take any blame for losing World War I. Let's look at extremist groups next. Now, the new Weimar Republic was very unpopular with extremist groups, and they carried out a number of uprisings to try and overthrow it. But the two most important that you need to know about are the Spartacist uprising in 1919 and the Kapp Putsch in 1920. So let's think first of all about the Spartacist uprising. This was carried out by the Spartacists. They were a communist group led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And what they wanted was a communist revolution similar to the one which had taken place in Russia in 1917. Now, ultimately, their uprising fails for a number of reasons. The leadership and the planning was poor, and the Weimar government was able to call on loyal troops, the Freikorps, who were ex-World War I soldiers, and they used them to crush the uprising. And as part of that, the leaders, Luxemburg and Liebknecht, were killed. The second uprising you need to know about, of course, is the Kapp Putsch, and let's focus in on that for a moment. First of all, this one was carried out by the Freikorps themselves, those ex-World War I soldiers who were fiercely anti-communist, and they were led by Wolfgang Kapp. So why did they do it? Two major reasons. They hated the terms of the Versailles Treaty, and they blamed the Weimar government for signing it. So they wanted to overthrow them and get rid of the treaty. They were also angry that the Weimar government tried to disband them. That means get rid of them, close them down, and so they launched an uprising. So Kapp marched to Berlin, and he's tried to seize power. Why did this fail? Well, the workers in Berlin went on strike. They wouldn't support Kapp, and that made it impossible for Kapp to rule. So ultimately, Kapp had to flee Germany. The Weimar Republic had survived. Okay, so now let's turn to problem 4, and that was the Constitution. Remember, a constitution is a set of rules which set out how the country is run. And the Weimar Constitution was very fair, it was very democratic, but it included a number of weaknesses which were problematic. First of all, every single German was guaranteed political freedoms under this constitution, such as the freedom of speech and the right to stand for election. Now that means that extremist groups themselves were able to use those political freedoms to attack the Weimar Republic. For example, they were allowed to stand for election to the Reichstag, and if they got elected to the Reichstag, they could then use that as a platform to attack the moderate parties and attack the idea of democracy. Secondly, the Weimar Constitution used an electoral system called proportional representation. Now, this is a very fair way of electing your government. All parties, including middle-sized and small parties, had a chance of winning seats in the Reichstag. Now, this was problematic. First of all, it meant that extremist parties could win seats, and that meant that they could get into the Reichstag and voice their views. And secondly, it also meant that no one party ever won a majority. So there was never a strong government. Instead, there were lots of coalition governments where more than one party had to work together to rule Germany. And these were often very unstable. They had to make compromises, they argued, they often fell out or they split. And there's a really good example of this. Between 1919 and 1923, there were 9 different coalition governments in Germany. Last but not least, it's also worth noting that one particular article of the Constitution caused problems. This is Article 48. And what it said was that in times of an emergency, the president could suspend democracy, shut democracy down, and laws could be made without the Reichstag. Now, after 1930, this Article 48 starts getting used quite frequently, including by Chancellor Brüning to deal with the Depression. And every time that Article 48 was used, it just seemed to reinforce Germans' views that democracy was weak and that democracy was incapable of serving Germany and solving Germany's problems, and that what Germany really needed was strong government, strong leadership. These 4 problems were bad enough, but in 1923 we get a year of crisis for the Weimar Republic. In fact, there were no fewer than 3 crises. We have the Ruhr occupation, hyperinflation, and we have the Munich Putsch as well. So let's talk about each of these briefly. First of all, the Ruhr occupation in January of 1923. In that year, Germany fell behind on its reparations payments. It was struggling to pay them. And so the French and the Belgians invaded the Ruhr and occupied it because it was a really valuable part of Germany. It had a lot of industry, coal and steel, and they decided to invade, to occupy it and take those resources instead of reparations. Germans in the Ruhr reacted to the occupation by passively resisting. They went on strike and they refused to work for the French. So factories in the Ruhr were no longer producing wealth for Germany. And that meant that the German economy struggled and became poorer. That leads on to crisis number 2, hyperinflation. Now, the German government couldn't afford the passive resistance in the Ruhr, so to cover the costs of it, the Weimar government started to print money. And printing money meant that the banknotes became worthless. People lost confidence in them. And as they became worthless, prices began to rise very fast, while savings and pensions lost their value. And it really was the middle classes who suffered most in this, because they had pensions and they had savings in the bank to lose. The Weimar government was blamed for this crisis, and it lost a good deal of support, particularly among the middle classes, who were naturally supporters of the Weimar government and democracy, and they never forget this crisis because they're not compensated for their losses. Last but not least then, the Munich Putsch, our third crisis in the year. In November of 1923, there's an attempt to overthrow the Weimar Republic by the Nazis. Now, this is triggered when Stresemann calls off the passive resistance in the Ruhr. He tells Germans in the Ruhr to stop their strikes and to go back and work for the French. For the extremist groups in Germany, they saw this as yet another betrayal. Here was Stresemann giving in to the French again after the humiliations of Versailles and the stab in the back myth, and now here he was giving in to France once more. And for the Nazis, this is the trigger for them to launch their Munich Putsch. They try and seize power in Munich, in Bavaria, which is a part of Germany where many extreme right-wing groups were based. And they really hoped that they would gain public support for this, because other Germans would be furious at Stresemann too. So, okay everybody, there you have it. We've looked at the early years of the Weimar Republic, we've seen some of the problems that it faced, and we've seen the events of 1923, a year of crisis for the Weimar Republic. So thanks for watching this revision tutorial everybody. Don't forget, there's lots more materials on the website. You can check out more videos on our YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe.